Elon Musk hears crying child. What follows will leave you speechless. The air buzzed with excitement and nervous energy as families gathered at the SpaceX launch site. The countdown for the next rocket test was less than an hour away, and the atmosphere was electric with the promise of witnessing something extraordinary. Children darted through the crowd, their laughter mixing with the hum of engineers making last-minute preparations. Large digital screens displayed live feeds from the control center, and booths offered snacks, merchandise, and even a virtual reality experience of life on Mars. Among the attendees, a young father in a navy blue polo shirt juggled a squirming toddler on his hip. The boy, no more than 3 years old, was red-faced and wailing, his cries piercing through the otherwise festive atmosphere. The father's face was a mask of frustration and helplessness as he bounced the child in his arms, trying in vain to soothe him. "Come on, Caleb," the man muttered, his voice low but tense. "This is not the time for one of your tantrums. Look, rockets. Isn't that exciting?" But Caleb was inconsolable. His tiny fists clenched, his face scrunched in anguish as he screamed louder. Nearby, other families began to glance their way, their smiles fading into awkward sympathy. Some shook their heads, muttering quietly about the disruption. "Someone's not having a good time," an older woman commented to her companion, her tone bordering on judgmental. The father sighed heavily, shifting Caleb to his other arm. He glanced toward the main event area, where a small stage had been set up for a Q&A session with none other than Elon Musk himself. The tech billionaire was scheduled to speak about the company's future plans for space exploration, a rare public appearance that had drawn hundreds of attendees. The father had been looking forward to hearing him speak, but Caleb's meltdown was quickly turning the outing into a disaster. "Maybe we should just go," the man murmured under his breath, his shoulders sagging. This was a mistake. Nearby, 2 men in sleek black suits stood watching the scene unfold. Their matching sunglasses and earpieces marked them as security personnel, but there was something about their posture, rigid and alert, that suggested they were more than just bodyguards. One of them spoke quietly into his wrist microphone, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd as if anticipating trouble. At the center of it all, Elon Musk stood near the stage, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his SpaceX jacket. His presence was understated yet magnetic, drawing a steady stream of onlookers hoping to snap a photo or exchange a word with the man behind the Mars mission. He listened patiently as an engineer briefed him on the launch schedule, nodding occasionally but keeping his gaze fixed on the bustling crowd. It was then that Elon's attention was drawn to the sound of Caleb's cries. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on the father and son, their struggle standing out amidst the otherwise orderly gathering. For a moment, Elon's expression softened, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or simply empathy for a parent in over his head. The engineer paused mid-sentence, noticing Elon's shift in focus. "Something wrong, sir?" he asked, following Elon's gaze. Elon shook his head slightly. "No, nothing," he said, though his tone carried a hint of distraction. "Go on." But as the engineer continued, Elon's attention remained on the father and son. He watched as the man tried to juggle a bottle of water and a diaper bag while Caleb continued to scream, his tiny face scrunched in misery. The sight seemed to weigh on him, though he said nothing. Meanwhile, the murmurs in the crowd began to grow. A few people pointed toward Caleb, their expressions ranging from amused to annoyed. One man leaned toward his companion, a smirk on his face. "Maybe someone should tell that kid this isn't daycare," he quipped, earning a chuckle. The father's face flushed with embarrassment. He tightened his grip on Caleb, rocking him gently but with mounting desperation. "Please, buddy," he whispered, his voice cracking, "just for a little while. I need you to calm down." But Caleb's cries only grew louder, his tiny fists pounding against his father's chest. It was clear that the toddler had no intention of settling, and the father's frustration was quickly turning into defeat. "Poor guy," a young woman nearby said, her tone laced with pity. "He's trying so hard, but that kid's a handful." "I don't know," another voice interjected. "If you can't control your kid, maybe don't bring him to something like this." The father heard the comment, and his jaw tightened. He avoided making eye contact with anyone, focusing instead on calming Caleb. But the weight of the stares and whispers pressed down on him like a physical burden. Unbeknownst to him, Elon had begun to move. With a subtle gesture to his security team, he stepped away from the stage, weaving through the crowd with the ease of someone accustomed to navigating public spaces. His expression was calm but purposeful, his sharp gaze fixed on the father and son. The security guards exchanged a glance, their movements tightening as they shadowed Elon. One of them spoke quietly into his earpiece, updating the team on their position. He's moving toward the east section, near the main stage barricade. Eyes up. As Elon approached, the crowd began to notice, their murmurs shifting from Caleb's cries to the unexpected presence of the SpaceX CEO. People stepped aside, their curiosity piqued as they watched Elon make his way toward the commotion. Cameras and phones came out, capturing the moment as speculation rippled through the audience. The father didn't notice Elon at first, too preoccupied with Caleb's escalating meltdown. But as the murmurs grew louder, he glanced up, his eyes widening in disbelief as he recognized the figure standing before him. "Elon Musk," he stammered, his voice thick with surprise. Elon offered a small, reassuring smile. "Looks like you've got your hands full," he said, his tone light but empathetic. He crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to Caleb's eye level. "Hey, little guy, what's all the fuss about?" Caleb's cries didn't stop, but they faltered slightly as he noticed the new face. His tear-streaked cheeks flushed red as he buried his face in his father's shoulder, peeking out cautiously at the man who had suddenly captured everyone's attention. The father blinked, still processing what was happening. I'm so sorry," he stammered, his words tumbling over themselves. "He's just having a bad day. I didn't mean to cause a scene." "You're not causing a scene," Elon said calmly. His gaze shifted back to Caleb, his voice softening. "But I think someone's having a pretty rough time." "Huh?" The tension in the air shifted slightly, the crowd now watching intently as Elon interacted with the crying toddler. But even as the moment unfolded, the undercurrent of whispers and judgment lingered, hinting that not everyone was as understanding as they seemed. Elon remained crouched at Caleb's level, his presence magnetic yet non-threatening. The toddler continued to bury his face in his father's shoulder, his cries muffled but persistent. Elon, unperturbed by the noise or the growing crowd of onlookers, waited patiently. His sharp eyes softened, studying the little boy with a mix of curiosity and understanding. "Caleb, is it?" Elon asked, his voice calm and even. He tilted his head slightly, trying to catch the child's gaze. "That's a strong name. You know what? It reminds me of a captain I once knew. A brave one." Caleb peeked out from the crook of his father's neck, his tear-streaked face scrunching up again as if he were deciding whether to cry louder or stay quiet. His father, visibly flustered, shifted uncomfortably. The attention of Elon Musk himself, paired with the judgmental eyes of the crowd, was clearly overwhelming. "Mr. Musk, I don't know what to say," the father stammered, adjusting Caleb in his arms. "I didn't mean to draw attention to us. We'll just step back so you can..." Elon raised a hand, a subtle but firm gesture that stopped the man mid-sentence. "You don't need to apologize," he said simply. "Parenting isn't easy. Believe me, I know. And sometimes a little patience goes a long way." The father blinked, clearly unsure how to respond. He glanced around at the growing crowd, where whispers had begun to ripple again. Some attendees looked on with curiosity, snapping photos or recording videos on their phones. Others exchanged glances, their expressions skeptical. "Why's he wasting his time on that kid?" a man muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. He was standing with his arms crossed, his expression one of annoyance. "We're here for the rocket launch, not some charity moment." Another voice chimed in, this time a woman with a sharp tone. "It's not fair to the rest of us," she said, shaking her head. "He should be on stage right now, not playing babysitter." Elon ignored the comments, his focus unwavering as he addressed Caleb again. He reached into the pocket of his SpaceX jacket and pulled out a small, sleek object, a keychain shaped like a miniature rocket. It gleamed under the sunlight, its polished surface catching Caleb's eye. "Have you ever seen a rocket this small?" Elon asked, holding it out in his open palm. His tone was light, almost playful. "It doesn't fly to Mars, but it's still pretty special." Caleb's cries faltered, curiosity creeping into his tear-filled eyes. He sniffled, his tiny fingers gripping his father's shirt tightly as he hesitated. Finally, he reached out cautiously, his small hand brushing against the keychain. For a brief moment, the tension in his face seemed to ease. The father let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know how you—" "Elon," a sharp voice cut through the moment, interrupting him. One of the SpaceX security personnel had stepped closer, his earpiece crackling faintly as he spoke. "We need to move you back to the stage. The Q&A is running behind, and we've got people asking questions about the delay." Elon glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. He gave a small nod but didn't move from his spot. "I'll join shortly," he said, his tone firm but polite. "Give me a moment." The security guard hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the delay, but he stepped back with a curt nod. Behind him, the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some people began checking their watches, while others crossed their arms, their patience wearing thin. "Why is he wasting time on this?" the man from earlier muttered again, louder this time. He gestured toward Caleb with a dismissive wave of his hand. "It's just a tantrum. Move on already." A few people nearby nodded in agreement, their expressions ranging from annoyance to outright disdain. The murmurs became a low hum of discontent, the crowd growing restless as their expectations for the event shifted. The father heard the comments, his face flushing with embarrassment. He tightened his grip on Caleb, his voice low and hurried as he spoke to Elon. "We should go. We're holding things up, and I don't want to." "You're not holding anything up," Elon interrupted, his voice calm but firm. He stood slowly, slipping the keychain back into his pocket as he addressed the father directly. "People can wait. You and Caleb are just as important as anyone else here." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that silenced the father. He nodded hesitantly, though his shoulders remained tense. Caleb, still clutching his father's shirt, looked up at Elon with wide eyes, his earlier cries reduced to soft sniffles. But the crowd was less easily appeased. The discontented murmurs continued, and one man near the front stepped forward, his frustration boiling over. "We didn't come here to watch a toddler throw a fit," he said, his voice sharp. "Some of us have been waiting all day for this event." Elon turned to the man, his expression cool and measured. "And you'll get your event," he said evenly. "But right now, there's a child here who needs a little compassion. Surely we can make time for that." The man opened his mouth to argue, but the intensity in Elon's gaze stopped him. He huffed, crossing his arms as he stepped back into the crowd. The murmurs died down slightly, though the atmosphere remained charged with tension. Elon turned back to Caleb and his father, his expression softening again. "Don't let them get to you," he said quietly. "People forget that it's the small moments that matter most." The father nodded, though he still looked overwhelmed. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "We've just been having such a hard time lately, and I—" "Save it," Elon said gently, raising a hand. "You don't owe me anything. Just focus on your son." Caleb, who had been watching the exchange silently, suddenly reached out again, his small hand grasping at Elon's jacket. His tiny fingers curled around the fabric, his eyes locking onto Elon's with a newfound curiosity. Elon smiled faintly, crouching back down to meet Caleb's gaze. "You're a tough little guy," he said, his tone warm. "I bet you've got a lot of adventures ahead of you." Caleb didn't respond, but for the first time since the interaction began, he let out a small, shaky laugh. It was fleeting, barely more than a sound, but it was enough to ease the tension around them. The atmosphere around the SpaceX launch site was growing more restless. The murmurs from the crowd behind Elon Musk and the small family were louder now, punctuated by audible sighs and the occasional pointed comment. While some attendees still observed the scene with curiosity or even sympathy, others had shifted to frustration. The event was running behind schedule, and the anticipation that had once electrified the air was steadily being replaced with impatience. Elon, however, remained focused. Caleb's tiny hand had tugged at his jacket just moments ago, and the faint laugh the toddler had let out seemed to have reignited a glimmer of hope in the father's eyes. Elon could sense the vulnerability in the man, a parent caught in an unrelenting moment of chaos, desperate for relief but unwilling to give up. He had seen it before, not just in parents, but in countless people striving to push past their limits. It was something he understood all too well. Caleb shifted in his father's arms, his earlier sobs now reduced to soft sniffles. His wide, teary eyes darted between his father and Elon, curiosity creeping in to replace his initial distress. Elon crouched once more, meeting the boy's gaze directly. "You know," Elon began, his tone light but thoughtful, "when I was your age, I cried a lot too. Probably louder than you, if you can believe it." Caleb blinked, his tiny fingers still clutching at his father's shirt. His lips quivered slightly, as though he couldn't decide whether to cry again or to listen. "Really?" the father asked, a weak smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He adjusted Caleb in his arms, shifting some of the weight to his other hip. "Somehow, I have a hard time picturing that." Elon chuckled softly, standing briefly to retrieve the miniature rocket keychain from his pocket again. "It's true. I was a handful, but you know what? Sometimes kids just need someone to listen." Even when they're not saying anything, he held out the keychain again, dangling it gently in front of Caleb. "Here, why don't you hold on to this for me?" Caleb hesitated, his small hand inching forward cautiously. When his fingers finally closed around the miniature rocket, the tension in his expression seemed to ease just a little more. He turned the keychain over in his hands, examining it with the intense curiosity only a child could muster. The polished surface gleamed under the sunlight, capturing his full attention. The father let out a soft, relieved sigh, his shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. "Thank you," he murmured again, his voice thick with gratitude. "I don't think I've ever seen him calm down this quickly." Elon gave a small nod but didn't respond immediately. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, noting the shifting dynamics. While some of the attendees were now watching the scene with muted interest, others were growing visibly irritated. A man near the barricades, a tall, broad figure with a sour expression, crossed his arms and shook his head in disbelief. "This is ridiculous," the man muttered, his voice carrying over the hushed murmurs around him. "We're here for a rocket launch, not a daycare session." A few people nearby nodded in agreement, their expressions souring. "He's Elon Musk," a woman added, her voice dripping with impatience. "Why is he wasting his time on this? Doesn't he have more important things to do?" The father heard the comments, and his face flushed red. He glanced down at Caleb, who was still entranced by the keychain, then back at Elon. I don't want to take up any more of your time," he said hurriedly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can see people are upset, and—" "You're not taking up my time," Elon interrupted, his tone steady but firm. He straightened, his posture radiating calm authority as he addressed the father. "And I don't make decisions based on a few grumbles from the crowd." The father's eyes widened slightly, and he nodded, though he still looked uneasy. Caleb, oblivious to the tension around him, turned the keychain over in his hands, his sniffles finally subsiding. The murmurs in the crowd, however, didn't subside. If anything, they grew louder. The tall man from earlier stepped forward, his frustration boiling over. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice sharp. "I don't mean to be rude, but some of us have been waiting for hours for this event. We didn't come here to watch a personal moment." Elon turned his head slightly, his sharp gaze locking onto the man. He didn't say anything immediately, allowing the weight of the silence to hang in the air. The man shifted under Elon's scrutiny, but his defiance didn't waver. "We all have places to be," the man continued, emboldened by the murmurs of agreement from others nearby. "This whole thing is holding up the schedule. Maybe it's time to get back to the stage and let security handle. Whatever this is, the crowd around the man murmured louder, a ripple of agreement spreading through the attendees. Some people folded their arms, their expressions hardening as they sided with the man. Others looked uneasy, glancing between Elon and the father, clearly unsure of where they stood. The father's face burned with embarrassment. He shifted Caleb in his arms, gripping the boy tightly as though shielding him from the judgment radiating from the crowd. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice breaking slightly. "Maybe we should." "Enough," Elon said, his voice calm but cutting through the noise like a blade. He stepped forward, his presence commanding, and addressed the crowd directly. "I understand your frustration. This event is important to a lot of people. But let me remind you why we're here." The murmurs quieted slightly, though the tension in the air remained. "We're here because we believe in something bigger than ourselves," Elon continued, his voice steady. "We believe in innovation, in progress, in creating a better future. That's what this rocket represents." He gestured subtly toward Caleb, who was still clutching the keychain. "And that future doesn't just belong to us, it belongs to them. The children who will grow up watching us reach for the stars." The crowd was silent now, their earlier impatience tempered by Elon's words. Some shifted uncomfortably, as though realizing the weight of their earlier comments. Others lowered their gazes, their expressions softening. The tall man didn't look convinced. He crossed his arms again, his jaw tightening. "That's all well and good," he muttered, though his voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness. "But there's a time and place for everything." "And sometimes," Elon replied, his tone unyielding, "the most important moments aren't the ones on the schedule." The man opened his mouth to argue but seemed to think better of it. He huffed and stepped back into the crowd, his earlier defiance extinguished. The murmurs quieted further, and the tension in the air began to ease. Elon turned back to the father and Caleb, his expression softening. "Don't let them get to you," he said quietly. "People forget that the future starts with moments like this." The father nodded, his gratitude evident, though his shoulders remained tense. Caleb, still engrossed in the keychain, let out a small, contented hum, his earlier distress now a distant memory. But even as the crowd settled, Elon knew the tension hadn't completely dissipated. The event was still behind schedule, and the undercurrent of impatience lingered, waiting to resurface at the slightest provocation. And yet Elon remained. He hadn't finished what he had set out to do. Caleb, now clutching the miniature rocket keychain, seemed mesmerized by it, his earlier tears a distant memory. Yet, despite the toddler's newfound calm, the unease among the crowd lingered, a reminder that this moment was far from resolved. The father shifted Caleb in his arms, his face still red with embarrassment. He avoided eye contact with the crowd, his shoulders hunched as though trying to make himself smaller. His gaze flickered to Elon, a mixture of gratitude and anxiety in his eyes. "Mr. Musk," he began hesitantly, his voice low, "I really don't want to cause any more trouble. We should—" "You're not causing trouble," Elon interrupted, his tone firm but kind. He gestured toward Caleb, who was still engrossed in the keychain. "Look at him. He's finding his calm. That's what matters right now." The father glanced down at Caleb, who was quietly turning the keychain over in his small hands. For a moment, the man's shoulders relaxed slightly, but the weight of the judgmental stares from the crowd quickly pulled him back into his shell. I don't want to ruin this event for everyone else," he murmured, his voice breaking slightly. Before Elon could respond, a voice from the crowd cut through. "Well, you're doing a pretty good job of that already," the man from earlier called out. He had stepped forward again, his arms still crossed and his expression sour. "We've all been waiting for this launch, and now it's being delayed because of—" He gestured toward Caleb and his father with a dismissive wave. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, though they were quieter than before. Most attendees seemed reluctant to outright voice their frustration after Elon's earlier words, but the tension was still palpable. The tall man, however, seemed emboldened by the silence. mistaking it for validation. He stepped closer to the barricade, his voice rising. "We didn't come here to watch a tantrum or a pep talk. We came to see the rocket. So maybe it's time to move this along." Elon turned to face the man fully, his calm expression hardening slightly. "And you think rushing through this moment will make the launch more meaningful?" he asked, his voice steady but sharp. The man faltered for a moment, clearly not expecting to be addressed directly. He cleared his throat, his gaze darting to the people around him as though searching for support. "I'm just saying, priorities, right? There's a time and place for everything, and this is the place for compassion," Elon replied, his tone unwavering. He gestured subtly toward the towering rocket in the background. "This launch represents more than just technology. It represents the values we hold as a society, the belief that we can do better, be better. That starts here, in the small moments, when we choose to show understanding instead of impatience." The man opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself, his jaw tightening. He stepped back into the crowd, clearly dissatisfied but unwilling to push further. The murmurs around him quieted, though the undercurrent of tension remained. Caleb, oblivious to the confrontation, let out a small laugh as he shook the keychain, the sound of the metal jingling drawing his attention. The innocent sound seemed to cut through the heaviness of the moment, drawing a few smiles from the crowd. Even the father managed a faint smile, though his unease lingered. Elon crouched down again, his sharp eyes softening as he addressed Caleb directly. "That's a good sound, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the keychain. "You know, that's a mini version of the rocket we're launching today. What do you think? Do you like rockets?" Caleb nodded hesitantly, his small fingers gripping the keychain tightly. "Rockets? Go boom?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with curiosity. Elon chuckled softly. "Not this one, I hope," he said, his tone light. "This rocket is going to help us reach the stars. Do you know why that's important?" Caleb shook his head, his wide eyes fixed on Elon. "It's important because it shows us what's possible," Elon continued, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone. "It reminds us that we can do big, amazing things if we work together. And maybe one day you'll help us build the next rocket." The father watched the interaction with a mixture of awe and gratitude. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, another voice from the crowd interrupted. "All right, that's enough," a woman said sharply. She had stepped forward, her expression stern as she addressed Elon directly. "You're wasting everyone's time with this. We've all been waiting for hours, and this is not what we came here for." Elon stood slowly, his calm demeanor unwavering as he turned to face the woman. "And what did you come here for?" he asked, his tone measured but carrying an edge of steel. The woman hesitated, her confidence faltering under Elon's steady gaze. I came here to see the launch," she said finally, her voice less certain. "To be part of something historic." "And what makes it historic?" Elon asked, his tone almost conversational. "Is it the rocket itself? The technology? Or is it the people who believe in what it represents?" The woman didn't respond, her jaw tightening as she crossed her arms. Elon didn't press her further. Instead, he turned back to the crowd, addressing them as a whole. "We're all here because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. But belief isn't just about the big moments, it's about the small ones, too. The moments when we choose to be patient, to show empathy, to lift each other up instead of tearing each other down." Caleb, still clutching the keychain, looked up at Elon with wide eyes. "Boom?" he asked again, his voice filled with innocent curiosity. Elon smiled, crouching down once more. "Not today," he said gently. "Today, it's all about reaching higher." The father let out a quiet laugh, his shoulders finally relaxing as he adjusted Caleb in his arms. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you for this." "You don't need to," Elon replied simply. "Just promise me one thing." The father nodded, his expression earnest. "Anything. Don't let moments like this pass you by," Elon said. "Even when it's hard, even when it feels like the world is against you, hold on to what matters, The father nodded again, his eyes glistening. He looked down at Caleb, who was now turning the keychain over in his hands, a small smile playing on his lips. The delay in the rocket launch schedule had stretched thin the patience of some attendees, and their whispered frustrations had begun to ripple outward once more. Elon watched Caleb for a moment, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He crouched down again, leaning closer to the boy. "Did you know," he said, his voice soft but deliberate, "that rockets like the one in your hand help us learn more about the universe? They take us to places we've never been before." Caleb looked up at him, his wide eyes still glistening from earlier tears. He clutched the keychain tightly, his little voice hesitant but curious. "Like the moon?" Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The moon, Mars, and maybe even beyond that someday. Rockets help us explore, and exploring is how we grow." The father, standing nearby and still visibly tense, watched the interaction with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "I can't thank you enough for this," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "You didn't have to." Elon cut him off gently, raising a hand. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his gaze still focused on Caleb. "Sometimes, it's the small moments that matter most." But not everyone in the crowd shared Elon's sentiment. The tall man who had spoken up was back at the barricade, his frustration now openly displayed on his face. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, and he exchanged irritated glances with a small group of attendees who seemed to share his views. "This is ridiculous," the man muttered, loud enough for those around him to hear. "We're here for a rocket launch, not story time." A woman nearby nodded, her arms folded. "At this rate, the launch will be over before it even starts," she said, her voice tinged with irritation. Another attendee, a younger man holding a camera, chimed in. "I get it, he's Elon Musk and this is a cute moment or whatever. But come on, there are hundreds of us here waiting for something we actually came to see." Their words didn't go unnoticed. The murmurs of agreement grew louder, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. People began to shift uncomfortably, their earlier excitement fading into frustration. Some glanced toward the stage, where the Q&A session had been postponed indefinitely. Others checked their watches, glanced at their phones, body language betraying their impatience. The father's face flushed again, and he adjusted Caleb in his arms as though trying to shield him from the growing hostility. I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice breaking slightly. "We didn't mean to." "You have nothing to apologize for," Elon said firmly, his tone cutting through the noise. He straightened to his full height, his presence commanding as he addressed the crowd. "I understand that some of you are frustrated. I understand that this event is important to you. But let me ask you something. What's more important, a launch schedule or showing a little compassion?" The murmurs quieted slightly, though the tension remained. The tall man at the barricade scoffed, his expression hardening. "Compassion doesn't launch rockets," he said, his voice sharp. "And it sure doesn't get people to Mars." Elon turned to face him fully, his gaze piercing. "No, it doesn't," he said evenly. "But the people who build those rockets? They do. And those people, engineers, scientists, dreamers, they start out just like Caleb here. Kids with curiosity. Kids who need encouragement and understanding." The man opened his mouth to respond, but Elon raised a hand, silencing him. "Every big idea starts with a small moment," Elon continued, his voice firm but measured. "Moments like this, moments where we choose to nurture curiosity instead of stifling it, to inspire instead of criticize." The man hesitated, his jaw tightening as he searched for a rebuttal. But before he could speak, a woman nearby interjected. "That's all well and good," she said, her tone sharp, "but some of us have been waiting for hours. We didn't come here for a motivational speech. We came to see history being made." Elon's gaze shifted to her, his expression calm but unyielding. "And history is being made," he said. "Not just with the rocket, but with every choice we make, big or small. What kind of history do you want to be part of? One where we rush past moments like this, or one where we take the time to remember why we're here in the first place?" The woman's face flushed, and she looked away, unwilling to meet Elon's gaze. The murmurs in the crowd quieted further, though the tension still lingered. Some attendees exchanged uncomfortable glances, their earlier frustration giving way to introspection. Others remained visibly annoyed, their arms crossed as they waited for the event to resume. Caleb, oblivious to the larger conflict unfolding around him, tugged on Elon's sleeve. "Do you build the rockets?" he asked, his voice small but curious. Elon smiled faintly, crouching down again to meet the boy's gaze. "I help," he said, "but it's not just me. It's a team of incredible people who work together to make it happen. People who started out just like you." Caleb tilted his head, his tiny fingers clutching the keychain tightly. "Can I build rockets too?" he asked, his voice filled with innocent wonder. Elon's smile widened slightly, and he nodded. "Absolutely," he said. "If you dream big enough and work hard enough, you can build anything you want." The father's eyes glistened, his gratitude evident as he adjusted Caleb in his arms. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything. I don't know how we'll ever repay you." "You don't need to," Elon replied simply. "Just keep believing in him and in yourself." The father stood stiffly, his hands tightening their protective hold around Caleb as though trying to shield him from the weight of the crowd's judgment. Caleb, oblivious to the tension around him, was now fixated on the miniature rocket keychain in his hand. The small child's curiosity and focus should have been a relief to the father, but the lingering hostility in the air only made him more anxious. Nearby, Elon stood firm, his presence steady and resolute. His gaze flickered between Caleb and the crowd, reading the faces of those who had gathered to witness the moment. There were still traces of awe and admiration in some expressions, but they were outnumbered by those who had grown impatient or disillusioned. Elon could feel the weight of the dissent, the unspoken accusations that he was wasting time, that the rocket launch, the real reason they were all here, was being delayed unnecessarily. "Mr. Musk," the father said quietly, his voice trembling, "I think we've taken enough of your time. Caleb and I will leave now." "You're not leaving," Elon replied, his voice calm but firm. He crouched down once more, his sharp eyes softening as he addressed Caleb directly. "What do you think, Caleb? Should we stay and watch the rocket launch together?" Caleb looked up, his wide eyes locking onto Elon's. "With you?" he asked, his small voice filled with wonder. Elon smiled faintly. "Yes, with me. But only if you promise to tell me what you think of the rocket once it takes off." Caleb nodded enthusiastically, his earlier tears now a distant memory. "I promise," he said, clutching the keychain tightly in his little hand. The father let out a quiet sigh of relief, but his shoulders remained tense as he glanced nervously at the crowd. The tall man at the barricade rolled his eyes dramatically, his arms crossing even tighter over his chest. "Unbelievable," the man muttered, his voice loud enough to carry. "This is a complete joke." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, though they were quieter now. The tall man, emboldened by even the smallest validation, took a step forward, his tone growing sharper. "We've been standing here for hours." "Hours? For what?" "To watch you play hero to one kid. How about you start acting like the leader everyone thinks you are and get back to the stage?" Elon turned slowly, his gaze locking onto the man with an intensity that silenced the murmurs around him. The air grew still, the weight of Elon's unyielding presence pressing down on the dissenters like a physical force. The tall man faltered for a moment, but his frustration was too deeply rooted to be completely quelled. "You think this is leadership?" the man continued, though his voice lacked some of its earlier bravado. "Wasting everyone's time while a bunch of engineers and scientists stand around waiting for you to do your job?" Elon didn't respond immediately. He took a step forward, his calm demeanor never wavering, and addressed the man directly. "Leadership," he said, his voice low but commanding, "is about more than just getting things done. It's about setting an example, about showing people what matters, especially in moments like this." The tall man scoffed, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "And what matters here? Delaying a historic launch for a crying kid? What matters, Elon replied, his tone sharp, is showing compassion. Because without it, all the rockets in the world won't get us anywhere worth going. The crowd fell silent, Elon's words hanging in the air like a challenge. Some attendees looked away, their earlier impatience giving way to introspection. Others exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of how to reconcile their frustration with the truth in Elon's statement. But the tall man wasn't ready to back down. He straightened, his expression hardening as he crossed his arms again. "That's a nice speech," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "But speeches don't launch rockets. And they don't pay for the tickets we all bought to be here today." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd, though it was less forceful than before. The father flinched at the words, his face flushing red as he instinctively pulled Caleb closer. The little boy looked up at his father, confused by the tension but too young to fully understand the weight of the moment. Elon's expression darkened slightly, his voice remained calm. "You're right," he said, addressing the tall man directly. "Speeches don't launch rockets. People do. And those people, every engineer, every scientist, every dreamer, were once kids like Caleb. Kids who needed encouragement. Kids who needed to believe they mattered." The tall man opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, a voice from the crowd interjected. "He's right," the woman who had spoken earlier said, stepping forward hesitantly. Her expression was thoughtful, her earlier irritation replaced with a quiet understanding. "I was upset at first, but he's right. This isn't just about a launch. It's about what the launch represents." A few more murmurs of agreement followed, though they were tentative. The tall man glanced around, his confidence wavering as he realized he no longer had the full support of the crowd. He took a step back, his jaw tightening as he crossed his arms again. Elon turned back to Caleb, his expression softening. "What do you think, Caleb?" he asked, his tone lighter now. "Do you think we should launch the rocket soon?" Caleb nodded eagerly, his earlier fear forgotten. "Yeah, I want to see it go to Mars." Elon smiled, standing to his full height once more. "Then let's make it happen." The crowd began to stir, their earlier tension easing as they sensed the moment shifting. The murmurs grew quieter, replaced with a renewed sense of anticipation. But even as the focus began to return to the rocket launch, Elon remained by Caleb's side, his presence a steady reminder of the lesson he had imparted. The tall man at the barricade remained silent, his earlier defiance now tempered by uncertainty. He glanced at the father and son, his expression unreadable, before turning his gaze toward the rocket in the distance. Whatever argument he had been preparing to make seemed to dissolve, the weight of the moment pressing down on him in a way he hadn't expected. Elon, however, wasn't finished. He turned to the father, his sharp eyes meeting the man's tired but grateful gaze. "This isn't just about today," Elon said quietly, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "It's about what comes next. For you, for Caleb, for everyone." The father nodded, his eyes glistening as he adjusted Caleb in his arms. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." Elon gave a small nod but didn't respond immediately. His gaze shifted back to the crowd, his expression thoughtful. The launch was about to begin, but the moment wasn't over yet. There was still more to say, more to show. The towering rocket in the distance, its sleek silhouette stark against the sky, once again took center stage in the minds of the attendees. Yet Elon Musk remained at Caleb's side, grounded in the moment as though time itself had slowed for this father and son. Caleb's small fingers still clutched the miniature rocket keychain, his wide eyes fixed on Elon with a mixture of awe and newfound confidence. His earlier tears were long gone, replaced by the kind of wonder that only a child could feel. His father, though still visibly tense, wore an expression of deep gratitude and relief, as though Elon's unwavering presence had lifted a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. "Do you think it'll be loud?" Caleb asked suddenly, breaking the silence with his soft, curious voice. He glanced down at the keychain in his hand, then back up at the towering rocket in the distance. "Like, really loud?" Elon chuckled, crouching down once more to meet Caleb's gaze. "Oh, it'll definitely be loud," he said, his tone light but sincere. "But that's part of the excitement. When you hear that roar, just remember, it's the sound of something incredible happening." Caleb nodded solemnly, his little brow furrowing as he processed the words. I want to make rockets when I grow up," he said, his voice filled with determination. "You can," Elon replied, his expression softening. "And when you do, I'll be cheering for you." The father's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he watched the exchange, his grip on Caleb tightening briefly. "Thank you," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know how to say it properly, but thank you." "You don't need to say anything," Elon said simply, rising to his feet once more. His gaze shifted toward the rocket, its frame gleaming in the sunlight as the launch team made their final preparations. "Just promise me you'll never stop believing in him and in what's possible." The father nodded, his expression resolute. "I promise." As Elon turned back toward the stage, a ripple of movement swept through the crowd. The murmurs of impatience had been replaced by whispers of anticipation, and all eyes were now fixed on the man who had somehow transformed what had felt like a disruption into something far more meaningful. Even the tall man at the barricade, who had been the loudest voice of dissent, stood silently now, his arms no longer crossed but hanging awkwardly at his sides. Elon's voice cut through the quiet, calm but filled with purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the crowd directly for the first time since the confrontation. "I know today hasn't gone exactly as planned, but sometimes the most important moments are the ones we don't plan for." His words hung in the air, their weight palpable. The crowd remained silent, their earlier frustration replaced by a collective sense of curiosity and respect. "This launch," Elon continued, gesturing toward the rocket in the distance, "isn't just about technology or exploration. It's about what we're capable of when we work together, when we believe in something bigger than ourselves." He paused, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. "And it starts here, with us, with the choices we make every day. To be kind, to be patient, to lift each other up instead of tearing each other down." The murmurs began again, but this time they were filled with agreement rather than dissent. People nodded, their earlier frustrations forgotten as they absorbed Elon's words. Even the tall man at the barricade seemed to shrink slightly, his earlier defiance replaced by an uneasy silence. Elon turned back to Caleb, who was watching him with wide, unblinking eyes. "Are you ready for the rocket, Caleb?" he asked, his tone lighter now. Caleb nodded eagerly, his small hands gripping the keychain tightly. "I'm ready." Elon smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "Then let's make it happen." As he stepped back toward the stage, the launch team sprang into action. The crowd began to stir, their focus shifting to the rocket as the final countdown loomed. The earlier tension was gone, replaced by a buzz of excitement and anticipation. The father adjusted Caleb in his arms, his expression one of quiet awe as he watched Elon walk away. For the first time that day, he felt a sense of peace, a reassurance that the moment they had shared would stay with Caleb for the rest of his life. "Do you think he'll remember me?" Caleb asked, his voice small but hopeful. The father smiled, pressing a kiss to his son's forehead. "I think he'll never forget you," he said softly. The crowd erupted into cheers as the countdown began, the numbers displayed on the large digital screens counting down from 10. Caleb's eyes lit up as the rocket roared to life, its engines igniting with a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath them. Elon stood at the edge of the stage, his hands tucked into the pockets of his SpaceX jacket as he watched the rocket lift off. His expression was calm, but there was a faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of what the moment represented. The rocket soared higher, its fiery trail cutting through the sky like a beacon. The cheers of the crowd grew louder, their earlier frustrations forgotten in the face of something truly extraordinary. And in the midst of it all, Caleb watched with wide eyes, his small hand clutching the miniature rocket keychain as though it were the most important thing in the world. His father held him close, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. As the rocket disappeared into the sky, the crowd's cheers began to fade, replaced by a quiet awe. People turned to one another, their earlier tensions dissolved by the shared experience of witnessing history. Elon turned back toward the crowd, his gaze briefly meeting Caleb's. He gave the boy a small nod, a silent promise that this moment, this small, fleeting moment, had been worth every second. The father watched as Elon disappeared into the throng of engineers and security personnel, his presence lingering like an unspoken reminder of what truly mattered. He looked down at Caleb, who was still staring at the sky with a look of pure wonder. "Did you see that, Dad?" Caleb whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It was amazing." The father smiled, his own eyes glistening. "I saw it, buddy," he said softly. "And you're amazing, too." And as the crowd began to disperse, the memory of the moment lingered, a testament to the power of compassion, curiosity, and the small choices that can change everything. Thank you for watching. This story isn't just about a rocket launch or Elon Musk. It's about the small, powerful moments that remind us of what truly matters. In life, we often get caught up in schedules, goals, and the rush to achieve the next big thing. But this story teaches us that sometimes it's the unplanned moments, the ones we stop to notice, that leave the greatest impact. And what about us? How often do we pause to show kindness, to inspire others, or to encourage the dreamers of tomorrow? Caleb's wonder and curiosity remind us that the future belongs to those who dare to dream. Let us know in the comments, what's one small moment in your life that changed everything? And how will you inspire the next generation? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.